welcome to your instructor lecture on cognitive development in middle childhood from 6 to 12. PJ Vygotsky, Information Processing, ADHD, and Intelligence. Part 2 will be language and whatever else. So first we are going to start with PJ. When we first met PJ, he was all about senses and movement in the sensory motor stage, where kids were exploring their environment by interacting with it directly, eventually moving into having mental representations so that they can, quote unquote, interact with things that are not directly in front of their senses or movement. Then children moved into the pre-operational stage, which was mostly categorized by the things that they couldn't do, so illogical ways of thinking. So although they had mental representation and the ability to manipulate mental thoughts, they're not doing it in a coherent, structured, logical way. So in the third stage of concrete operations from 7 to 12, which is, ish when kids enter school, then we have everything we didn't have in the previous stage. So it makes life very simple. Now we have concrete operations, which means concrete, logical ways of dealing with the environment. So they are now better at decentering their thought, rather being fixated on one thing, often appearance. They're better at classification, categorization, serial categorization, so being able to classify things as members of one group and perhaps also a superordinate group. They have conservation abilities, so squishing a ball of clay doesn't mean there's more mass. Moving water doesn't mean there's more water. They have reversibility skills, so they can unthink a cake back to its original component parts through batter. Ooh, very exciting. What are they still missing? Because we do still have a stage left. So although 7 to 12-year-olds are logical thinkers, according to Piaget, they are not abstract thinkers. So it's hard for them to get away from what's concrete. It's hard for them to think in hypotheticals. So a good question at this age would be, if 2 and 2 is 22, what's 4 plus 4? An adult would say, oh, then it's 44. And a child who's concrete would say, it's 8. What is wrong with you? So they're unable to move away from that concrete way of thinking to a more abstract way of thinking. Some of the other things they might have problem with, things like Venn diagrams. So where the premises are illogical. So all flowers are animals, all animals can jump, therefore all flowers can jump. This follows logically from those statements, but of course one of them is a false premise, and a child in a concrete operational stage will not be happy with that. Another one of my favorite examples is to give them a bunch of sandwich components and ask how many sandwiches could you build. So you give them chicken and jelly and bread and Spam, right? And you ask how many sandwiches they can make. And so they'll tell you, you can make a jelly sandwich, a Spam sandwich, a chicken sandwich. Maybe they get a little creative and say you can make a chicken and Spam sandwich. But what they're not going to tell you is that you can make a chicken Spam jelly sandwich. So it's a perfectly acceptable combination, but it's not an acceptable sandwich. So that's the difference between an adult who's going to be able to use their abstract thinking skills and think, okay, well, first the bread, and then we'll do one of each, and then we'll mix them up by 2s, and then we'll mix them up by 3s to create all the possible sandwiches, and the concrete thinker who's only going to create sandwiches that anyone with a right mind would actually eat. Finally, another example would be some of the things we ask kids to do later on in high school that they couldn't do here. So asking a kid at this age to do things like analyze themes in literature, just don't. Good luck with that, right? Analyze the themes of Romeo and Juliet would be a very no assignment for most kids until they hit high school, because it's way too abstract and not concrete enough. So those are some examples of what they can't do. Vygotsky doesn't really have much new to say here, so he's still saying that the learning of the child is going to depend on the social context. In this case, their social context includes school. So what the school is teaching and how the school is teaching it, whether they use things like reciprocal teaching, so back and forth teaching, partnership teaching. Vygotsky would also have things to say like how you build groups. So he would want mixed ability groups. So higher ability kids can kind of pull up the lower ability kids. Information processing also doesn't have much new to say. So memory continues to improve. Attention skill improves. We've got more information in long-term memory. Better organization, particularly in areas where the child has done a lot of work. They might be starting to develop expertise in an area where they spend a lot of time. They also have better metacognition, so they know more how their things are going to work. They're less likely to say, oh, give me 20 and I'm sure I'll remember all of them. More likely to be more realistic. They're also starting to use more memory strategies, including repetition, organization, elaboration, which is tying new things to old things, writing things down, all that good stuff. So here you can see digit span increasing, which is kind of a straight up measure of memory. So they still have slightly inflated beliefs about their memory skill at the beginning of the stage, but they should be better by the end of the stage. ADHD doesn't really fit here, but this is where we're going to talk about it. I guess it kind of makes sense because school age is one of the places where kids are most likely to encounter an early suggestion of a diagnosis of ADHD. Very often, the first person to suggest this diagnosis is a teacher. What does ADHD look like? Well, obviously, there's problems with attention, so directing attention, sustaining attention, ignoring distractors. And then sometimes also issues with hyperactivity and impulsivity. That's obviously going to create a poor combination with how we structure most of our schoolrooms. So once kids hit first grade, we have an expectation of them being able to follow orders, sit still, pay attention, and these things would be very challenging for a child with ADD. Currently, we believe this disorder affects as many as 3 to 7% of children, and about 4 times as many boys as girls. That could be because they're, for some reason, biologically more prone, or it could be because the qualities of being a boy are similar to the qualities of having ADHD. So there's a lot of concern that ADHD is overdiagnosed and overmedicated, which doesn't mean it's not a real disorder. And it doesn't mean that the medication isn't incredibly necessary and helpful for some children. But if you think about school readiness, the fact that we say, okay, all kids should be ready for school at age 6 doesn't necessarily jive well with how all kids work in terms of where they're at with their activity level, physical play, attention skills, memory skills. So part of this may be that kids are forced into this very rigid school setting who aren't really there yet. So are we medicating them because there's an inherent problem with the child, or are we medicating them because at their current stage of development, they can't do well in that situation? So that's one of the things to really look for with ADHD is it in every situation? So a kid with ADHD is going to have problems everywhere, at home, at play, on the playground, in the supermarket. If the problem is only in school, then it may be more of an issue with the school setting for this particular child. So there is a lot of controversy in this area. And part of the reason is that the standard medication for ADHD is essentially speed. So they're quite strong drugs. They have side effects, problems with, lack of appetite, problems with sleeping, and the amount has gone way, 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 way up in the United States, and particularly in the US, as compared to everybody else. Our numbers have increased much more than Canada, the UK, Germany, Australia, etc. Now, the idea that you would give a hyperactive kid stimulant medicine sounds crazy on its face, but as I explained to my interest psych students, kids with ADHD actually have underactive brains, not overactive brains. So you have to imagine what it's like to be in the most boring meeting you've ever sat in, right? Everything is going to distract you. You're going to be doodling and tapping your foot just to try to stay awake. And that, presumably, is what it may be like to have a brain that's working on ADHD. Right? Every little thing is like, ooh, what's that? What's that? What's that? Because your brain is incredibly bored. So the idea is give your brain an upper, you can actually focus more. If you look at medications in the states, you also will find that there are big differences depending on where you are at in the state. Illinois actually has one of the lower rates of ADHD meds. You can see overall a lot of it kind of in these southern states rather than the western states. So this is just a little bit more about Ritalin and its friends. So this is a Schedule II substance with a high potential for abuse. It's not uncommon for kids to be selling their Ritalin. It has similar effects to cocaine or amphetamines, including binge use, psychotic episodes, cardiovascular problems, and severe addiction. We've been seeing increased abuse by teens and young adults of these substances and increased visits to the ER. And we're also seeing in early adulthood huge increases in the use of other types of drugs, specifically pain-killing drugs. And so that's become now one of the top 5 causes of death for young adults, is the abuse of opioid painkillers, often as mixed with alcohol. So there certainly could be a relationship between those two things. If you look at percentage increases, you can see the ADHD drugs increased by 39% from 2007 to 2011. So a little bit more information. So here's, as I said, looking at brain activation. Overall brain activity is actually lower in an ADHD brain. If you look at some of the statistics, you can see that the numbers are really, really high. So 1 in 15, 4 to 10-year-olds, 1 in 9, 11 to 14-year-olds, 1 in 10, 15 to 17-year-olds. Depending on how severe it is, the more severe it is, the earlier it's likely to be diagnosed. 69% of children are taking meds. Boys are much more likely to have this disorder than girls. And there are some differences also by ethnic background, with Hispanic or Latino children being the least likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. As I said, often the diagnosis originates in the school, often from a teacher. This is often a lifetime diagnosis, so it's not something everybody grows out with. And another concern there is that these drugs, you can build up tolerance to them and they stop being effective, and eventually you may run out of drugs. So that can be a concern as well if we're talking about something that is a lifetime issue. We should probably be at least trying to do more with non-medication based interventions, cognitive and behavioral therapy and such. So it's a lot to talk about here, but there are certainly other things to look at. I mean, if it were my kid, just straight up, if it were my kid, I would probably try everything else first. Make sure it's not sugar, make sure it's not a food allergy, make sure it's not, too much caffeine, make sure they're getting enough exercise. But if, I looked at all of those things, tried to work with cognition and behavioral therapy, and it was down to, I give this kid a drug, or maybe they don't learn to read. Yeah. Okay. I would certainly at that point consider medication. So it's just be aware that there's a lot of concern that it's being overdiagnosed and overtreated, and specifically overtreated with medication. Another issue once kids hit school is what may or may not be going on with their intelligence. Now, a few words about intelligence. Intelligence in school is not the same as intelligence. So intelligence overall is the ability to basically be effective in the whole culture you find yourself in. So that can be very different if you find yourself in the US culture, or if you find yourself, in Maasai, in the middle of the Maasai Mara in a Maasai tribe. What you need to know might be very different. You might suddenly need to know weather patterns and animal tracking and how to build a hut, etc. So it's whatever you need to be successful in your culture. In our culture, part of that is academics. You have to be able to read, you have to be able to write, basic math. But there are a lot of things that IQ tests don't actually look at. Things like social skills, technology skills, people skills, creativity, which is not at all correlated with IQ. So just be aware that when we're talking about assessing intelligence in the school setting, we're only looking at a subset of intelligence. We're looking at whatever it is that helps kids to do well in school. And that's what the history of intelligence testing is. So it goes back to Binet, who was asked by the French government to figure out a test so that they could pinpoint children who might be slow learners, and they could get them, remediation and extra help. So that's kind of the history of intelligence testing. It's really focused on whatever it is that helps us do well in school. Okay. These are meant to be aptitude tests and ability tests. So they are meant to test your ability to do well in the future. They are not meant to be achievement tests or tests based on what you already know. So something like the Iowa Basic Test of Skills is an achievement test. It's supposed to measure whether you have skills. Right? Did you learn to read and write and stuff? The IQ tests are meant to look at, can you acquire skills in our school system? Okay? So that's what they're supposed to do, and there are some problems with them. So these are some examples from the Stanford-Binet test. It was originally the Binet-Simon test, but it was renormed at Stanford. You can see that the items differ based on age. And the idea is you would start a kid several years before their actual age and see how well they would do, how many ages they can kind of go up to. Originally, this was assessed by comparing their mental age, which is the last level of task they could pass, to their physical age. And then just doing math. So if the kid is 10, but they're 12-year-old mentally, it's 12 divided by 10 times 100 or 120. If they're at their physical level, their IQ is 100. So 100 is average IQ. If they're under it, so they're 10, but they only pass the 8-year-old items, their IQ would be 80. So that's the way it was done originally. Now it's graded on a curve. So it's compared to, tens of thousands of people who had taken the test before. If you outperform half of them, you're assigned an IQ of 100, okay, average IQ. Now notice when looking at the kinds of items that might be on an IQ test, and these are of course the more verbal items, there are also a whole set of nonverbal items which are intended to get at IQ a little bit better, particularly for someone for whom maybe English isn't their first language, or they don't have the same cultural capital. Because if you look at a question like number 9, in an old graveyard in Spain, they discovered a small skull which they believe to be that of Christopher when he was 10. What's foolish about that? I mean, notice to answer that question, you have to have cultural capital. You have to know who Christopher Columbus is. So one thing to understand about IQ tests is you can't do them without context, at least not the verbal parts. And your children are going to have different access to both the vocabulary and the background knowledge the test assumes. So it tends to assume a knowledge set that's there if you are a white middle-class child growing up in the Midwest, and may not be there if that's not where you grew up. That being said, our schools are also biased. So kids who grew up white in the Middle West with standard English are probably going to perform better in the schools. So just because the test predicts how well we're doing in school doesn't mean it's a fair test of actual intelligence. It means it's testing ability to perform in our school system. Our school system is biased. The test is also biased. All these things are true at the same time. I know that's a little bit confusing. Okay? So it does what it's supposed to do, but that doesn't mean it's an actual fair test of aptitude in general, even if it is a fair test of aptitude to do well in our school system. Here are some examples of the nonverbal items. This originally actually came into play with the Wechsler test. The Wechsler test wanted a test for adults, specifically for people going into the Army. The Army asked them, hey, can you get us something that's a little more nonverbal? Because they were concerned about recruits for whom English wasn't a first language and that they were wasting talent. So they wanted something that was less English dependent. So that's where this kind of came from. And so you can see you've got tests like reproduce this pattern with younger children, things like stringing beads, what fits here, what's weird about this. Some of these, again, also require cultural capital like this, or this question, which one's strange, or what's weird about this. Others not as much, reproduce this pattern from these particular blocks. And today, because there's a really pretty wide variety of questions, it does give you more than just one number. So it's not just here's your IQ. It gives you a lot of sub-scores now in various areas. So there's questions that map onto, visual stuff. There's questions that map onto verbal stuff, questions that map onto math stuff. So if you look at the Wechsler test, they're fairly comparable tests these days. It gives you a verbal comp scale, a working memory scale, a perceptual reasoning scale, and a processing speed scale, and then some subsets. So this can be useful not only for predicting how well someone would do in school, but it can also be useful sometimes for picking out where a learning disability might be, whether it's in a specific area or not. There are other tests besides Stanford-Binet. The Wechsler test for adults is called the WACE. It also has versions for children called the WISC and for infants called the WIPSI. But all of these now give quite a few subscores. So you'll get an overall IQ, which does a pretty good job predicting how well you're likely to do in our school system, and then you'll get some subsets. So when are you going to use this? You're going to use this, A, because you're doing psychological tests on IQ. B, if you're trying to figure out if there's an issue with a kid, is there an IQ issue or is there a learning disability? You want to rule out IQ first, because learning disabilities are not the same as issues with IQ. You might also be able to get some information on if it's in a specific area with a learning disability. These are also used sometimes to make decisions about like bumping kids up, skipping a grade, holding kids back. So they can be pretty high importance tests for kids. So I think it's worth understanding how they work. Here's some items from the WACE. Again, these are the nonverbal items. So make your diagrams. What goes here? Again, you notice there's a lot of cultural capital needed here to understand what the heck this thing even is. Okay, use of puzzles and so forth. So this looks at how IQ falls out today. It is a curve, a standard normal distribution. So most people fall within 68% of the median. So average IQ is anywhere from 85 to 115. So that's the bulk of people. This group right here, 115 to 130, another 14% of the population would be referred to as fast learners. Slow learners over here. Then you get out into the tail. So we're talking about only 2% and change of the population in each tail. Anything out here would be gifted, although there are other ways to be gifted, like having a particular talent in an area. Anything out here would be developmentally disabled, new term for mental retardation. If you're in this area, there are some subsets, so mild, moderate, severe, and profoundly developmentally disabled, all decreasing in frequency. I should note you also have to be under the age of 18 for that as a diagnosis. Out here, there really aren't those same kind of blocks, but we talk about Mensa level geniuses and super geniuses. A lot of people get worried that people in this block have all kinds of poor social skills. This is really not accurate unless you get way out here. So if you start getting out like 180 plus, then yeah, those kids have some problems talking to other kids on their same level. If you had to ask me at its center, what is this thing? What are we measuring? I honestly think a lot of it is straight up this processing speed. Okay? Because our processing speed is going to underlie our abilities in several of these other areas as well, right? Working memory. If you can think things in your head faster, you can stick more things into memory. Verbal comprehension, etc. So that's my guess. If I had to put a name on it, it's kind of overall speed of processing. And if it's faster, you got an advantage in our school system. So, how good is this test? Is it standardized? Standardization just means a lot of people have taken it and we know what average behavior looks like. And if it looks like a standard normal curve, even better. And IQ passes that test. Is it reliable? Do you get the same result if you give someone the test more than once? Mostly. So 0.70 correlation between test retest, which means if you're in the middle, you're probably not going to move around. But if you happen to be borderline, it's certainly conceivable that if you retake it, you might fall one higher or one lane lower. Okay? So, demand a retest if you're not happy with it and you're in the borderline. But if you're at 100, the odds you're going to score outside of average are pretty low. Unless something really weird happened when you took the test. What could affect reliability? Of course, anything about that particular testing situation. The kid freaks out. The person who does the test scares them because these are one-on-one tests. At least they're meant to be. They were sick that day, whatever. And stress. You also could get practice effects. So if you take the test a second time, you might just be more comfortable with it and understand the instructions, so your grades might go up. Is it valid? Does it measure what it's supposed to measure? There, it really depends what you correlate it with. If you correlate it with what the average person assumes it means, which is kind of total life success, then it does not such a great job. So 0.4 isn't terrible, but it's not good either. If you correlate it with what it's supposed to do, which is high school GPA or college GPA, it actually does a really good job. So it is pretty valid in measuring what it is supposed to measure, as long as you assume that's doing well in school and not the much broader thing that intelligence actually is. Where does it come from? So I can answer this very quickly. It comes from both your genetics and how you're raised. So the twin and adoption studies, if you look at identical twins reared apart, they still have very highly correlated IQ scores. Okay, so granted, it's not like healthy babies who are adopted get adopted everywhere. They're mostly being adopted into middle or upper class families. So they're not wildly different environments, but they're still very highly correlated, much more correlated than siblings, even who are reared in the same family. So there's clearly a big genetic component of whatever the heck this is. Most people would say if you had to lean one direction or another, it might be a little more genetic, but it depends on the specific situation, right? So if you have two parents who are rocket scientists, but you take the kid, you lock them in a box, you beat them every time they make noise, don't do that. You'll get in trouble. Your kid's not going to have a high IQ. So extremely problematic environments or extremely good environments might have a much larger effect than the average environment. Here's some more data. This one looks at socioeconomic status. You can see that if the biological and adoptive parents are both well off, IQs average about 120, whereas if the biological and adoptive parents are not well off, IQs average about 92. So money definitely has an effect. And that could be both things like, prenatal health care and also things like how you raise your kid, books in the house, quality of schools, etc. This chart up here looks at racism. So this particular group in Japan is discriminated against, even though there's no genetic difference. And you can see that they have much lower IQs on average. So 37.6% have an IQ below 76 versus 9.9 in this other population. And that can be for a number of reasons, both in terms of, how they're raised, but also part of it could be stereotype threat. So one thing we know is that when kids go to take a test, if they think they're going to do poorly on it, that in and of itself makes them do poorly on it. And there's tons and tons and tons of research on that. So it may be partially testing also. This down here looks at risk factors. The more risk factors in your life, the lower IQ tends to be. Granted, look, this is not zero, right? So raised in poverty, abusive parents, poor schools, you name it. And then this is some really interesting data I found that looks again at adoptive children and finds that in some things, adopted children are much more closely correlated to their birth parents than to their adoptive parents, which is a strong genetic component. So this chart up here is looking at verbal ability. So as the kid gets older, they start to look a lot like their adopted parents. So these are children and their birth parents. These are adopted children and their birth parents. And this one down here, which is much less correlated, are adopted children and their adoptive parents, which is kind of doing not much at all. And then similar here with spatial skills. Okay, so adopted children don't look very much like their adopted parents at all. It's basically a 0. Okay? But they do look significantly more similar to their birth parents. Kind of cool. Another thing to understand about IQ and IQ testing. Okay, big, huge book came out called The Bell Curve. I believe it was in 95. Don't quote me on that. Might have been 91, somewhere in there. And found this difference that you can see down here, which is that African and Hispanic Americans have an average IQ that is lower than that of European Americans. They were not considering Asian Americans for reasons that will become clear, because the guy who wrote this book was a big bleep. Right? So this difference is real, it's reproducible. And so the guy who wrote this book used this to claim that this is a genetic issue, and it became a big thing. There were protests on campuses all over the country, blah, blah, blah. So here's what I have to say on this. A, the effect is real. B, it has nothing to do with genetics. So why do you see these differences? Well, there's huge money differences between these groups. So differences in access to health care, differences in how much kids are able to speak to their kids because they're working 3 jobs, differences in socioeconomic status, differences in nutrition. I mean, it's surprising these differences aren't bigger. If you compare only groups that are socioeconomically similar, so middle class families of different ethnic groups, pretty much most of these differences go away. So now you know that data is out there and you know why that data exists. Beyond that, I mean, you would still find small differences. Part of that may be stereotype threat, right? So European kids are like, yes, this test is for me. I'm going to do great. And that might give them an advantage. The testing environment might give them an advantage. The fact that it's one-on-one, these testers, I'm guessing, are probably also mostly Caucasian. That might give them a step up. They might just be more comfortable. They may have experienced more tasks that are like the tasks in the test. Like my mom had Games Magazine growing up, and a lot of the kind of stuff that's in Games Magazine is really helpful for some of the weird questions on IQ tests. People also pointed out to this guy, hey, what about Asians? Why are they so much better? He had nothing to say about that, right? It's all about European Americans having great genes. But there is a difference there, and there's not a huge socioeconomic difference. So most people point to as well, like family expectations and drivenness and attributions. So on average, an Asian kid who comes home with, a C, first of all, their parents are going to freak out way more. And they're more likely to say it's because you didn't try hard enough, you need to try harder, here's tutoring. Whereas the average European American family is more okay with slightly lower grades, and they're more likely to attribute it to ability. Well, so just not so good in English, that's fine. You're great in dance. So you do have some cultural differences playing into these effects also. I'm going to skip the fun effect. You don't really need to know. Other concepts of intelligence that are out there are going to wait until the next video. So, coming soon. Language and other ways to look at intelligence.